Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, Namah Shivabhyam, Namah Sabhayai. So, my presentation is going to be on this topic, Sambandhar's Vaidika Saiva mission and his conflict with the Jainas, a study. Next slide. And okay, so this is the outline of the presentation. So I will first introduce this topic. So why this study and this topic, a historical puzzle, you would say, or a historical problem, is important and relevant. I'll introduce that, and then I will develop the narrative in this paper. So what were the conditions of Tamil Nadu during the advent of Sambandhar? So before and after him, how it was. And the main theme would be the Jaina influence leading to social stagnation, which the Vaidika Saiva theology, how it came as a big counter to that. And it will be in the, I will talk about it in the domains of music, language and literature, status of women, religion and society. And then there would be an analysis of Sambandhar's very harsh criticism of Jainas in his hymns, which many of you would think something very un-Hindu, of any Hindu sage. The Madurai episode of Sambandhar's victory over Jains. So there will be a study of that. And then the story of this triumph of Sambandhar over Jains in the light of history. And what are the conclusions? So this will be the outline of this paper. And in the previous, can you go back to the previous slide? Just the previous slide, yeah. So what you see there is the beautiful Panchaloha icon of Sambandhar. Many might mistake that for calling a Nartana Krishna, but that is actually Sambandhar dancing. Okay, next slide. So Sekrar, in his 12th century Kavya of Periya Puranam, that narrates the story of all Saiva saints, Nayanmars, he has this line, Inda Manilathin Irul Neengida, Vanda Vaidika Mamani Yanavar. In fact, in Periya Puranam, which has about 4,000 verses, roughly about 50% of the verses are dedicated to this one Nayanar called Sambandhar. Okay? And the stories of all the 62 other Nayanars are told in the remaining part of the epic. So it is like 1 versus 62. That is kind of the importance of the foremost place that is given to Thiringyana Sambandhar in the Saiva tradition. So this line, which I just quoted in Tamil, means the great Vedic gem who was born to eradicate the darkness that engulfed this land. So what is this? So we all know that Periya Puranam is a hagiographic, Puranic style account with many mystical and supernatural events and miracles and all that. Just like many such, kavyas in the Hindu tradition about sages. But what I want to stress is that beneath this whole thing, there are some very important and very realistic historical narratives that are present in these hagiographic accounts. And the importance and the lasting impact of Sambandhar's hymns and mission cannot be understated. So I showed you there are Panchaloha icons of Sambandhar in many forms. In almost every major Saiva temples across Tamil Nadu, along with other Nayanmars, festivals are celebrated in his honor. And there are temples where many of his hymns are chanted every day. So that is one theme. That is the first main theme of this paper. The second theme is that there is a narrative that the non-Vedic schools, especially the Bauddha and Jaina schools, were more egalitarian, more progressive, and more people-friendly than Vaidika religion. This is always a running narrative in the Nehruvian, post-Nehruvian Indian historiography. Buddhism is cool, but Hinduism, okay, either it's a hodgepodge of things or it is regressive This kind of a general narrative. But what does the history say, really? If we analyze the history, what do we get out of it? That's the second theme. And the third theme of this, the relevance of this topic is that the Vedic versus non-Vedic schools, the conflicts and debates, there is Shastrartha and Vadas that happened in the length and breadth of this country, all over, right? And we all know that these were philosophical, intellectual debates, very in-depth debates. But there is a tendency among the Marxist school of historians, especially, to call them as some kind of religious wars, you know. So as if India also had a religious war. So there are some very few occasions where this intellectual debate actually lapsed into some kind of a physical violence or conflict. There is some small evidence, but very, very fringe and very, very minor. It was largely intellectual and philosophical, but still there is a narrative like this built up. And even between the inter-Vedic school rivalry, like Saiva versus Vaishnava, or Vedanta versus the Sankhya, Nyaya type schools, even these are kind of colored as religious war kind of things, right? And specifically, in this Sambandhar episode, so there is a legend about the impalement. Impalement means, I'm sure all of you know that, it's a very crucial form of punishment where there is a very sharp-edged object is kept and a person is made to sit on that and he dies a horrible death. Okay? So there is this legend about the impalement of large number of Jain monks by aggressive Shaivism as part of the Sambandhar narrative. So we will probe that episode. So that is the relevance of this topic. Is this. Okay, we'll start with the conditions of the Tamil country during the advent of Sambandhar. If you read the Tamil history, starts with the Sangam classical age, 200 BCE to 300 CE, 500 years. So much of literary outputs, the Ettu Togai, 8 anthologies, Pattu Pattu, 10 hymns. So this entire corpus of Sangam literature contains so many references to Vedas, Rishis, Puranas, deities like Shiva, Vishnu, Kartikeya, Durga, all that. And this was a period when the Tamil Nadu was ruled by Chera, Chola, Pandya kings mainly, and many small princes and chieftains. Immediately after that period, there is something called a Kalabra interregnum. So interregnum is a technical word in history. The historians would know it. So it was originally thought of as some kind of a dark period, like dark ages in the European history, where the society completely lapsed into darkness. You know, nothing much was happening. In fact, Nilakanta Shastri in 1950s actually wrote these words, dark period, in his famous History of South India book. But later, we find that there are many texts like Tirukkural, Silappadigaram, written during this period. So the later historians gave a very nuanced picture, saying that, you know, the Kalabra period has certain dark aspects, but it was not totally evil. There was good literary output during that period. So both kinds of books are written. So I gave the picture of two books. So one is a black and white, the other is a colored one. But in general, all historians agree that during this period, there was ascendancy of Jaina and Bauddha religions and decline of Vedic culture and native Tamil traditions. There is a unanimity among all historians on that. And there were shift in values, philosophy, culture and aesthetics, predominantly because of the Jaina, Buddha, Bauddha influences. And there was social constriction and stagnation due to this. And Sambandhar, who is dated to the first half of 7th century, 600 to 650 CE, was born at that time. So you must remember that Kalabras were defeated, okay, by the end of 6th century, by the Pallavas and Pandyas. They were politically defeated, but the influences that the Kalabra age had set in, they were still lingering when Sambandhar was born. So the next few slides would describe how this Jaina influence was countered by Vaidika Shaivism. So music, first thing. The Sangam age was very rich in musical tradition. There were like yar, which is a proto form of veena, and muravu, drums. And there were a community of musical bards called Panar. They were wandering all over and gained so much respect. But in the later Kalabra age literary texts, we see that they were actually called Yirisinar. They fallen to low status and they became a disappearing tribe. So whatever I am speaking, I have given elaborate references in my paper. Okay, so I am just not saying some general sweeping statements. You can see in the paper the reference to the books and other things. So one reason the historians attribute to this is that the Jaina theology says that the music is snare and it hampers spiritual progress. So in Jain texts like Jivaka Sintamani, there are stories where the music led to a person's spiritual downfall and all that. But Sambandhar revived the Tamil music, which was a greatest contribution. In fact, the history of Indian music cannot be complete without the name of Thirignana Sambandhar. So what he did, all his hymns are set to these traditional ragas called pan, and he himself went around singing them all over. So I'm not going into the actual story of Sambandhar, just to give you a brief sketch if you didn't know it. So when he was 3 years old, he cried for milk like any other child. But at that time, his father was taking bath, no one was around. It is said that Parvati Devi himself came and gave him the milk of wisdom, and he started singing. So this child saint, so he goes around singing, clapping his hands from temple to temple. Because of this continuous clapping, his hands are hurt. So in one place, the Parvati Devi, suddenly some 2 golden symbols fall on his hand. So symbols means this jhallari or jhalar, what you call. And as you see in all pictures, he appears with those symbols. So what does this really mean? A kind of a miraculous incident. But what this really means is that the knowledge of the thala, rhythm, was actually disappearing. People were forgetting the nuances of the thala, and that knowledge was revived by Sambandhar. So that is kind of told through this Puranic style story. So if you see the hymns of Sambandhar, there are many. One goes like this. Madar mada pidiyodum mada annamum annador nadai vudai malai magal nadai udai malai magal nadai udai malai magal nadai udai malai magal tunayana magilvar. See the complex rhythm in this hymn. So this thala knowledge was revived by Sambandhar. And the other aspect is that this Tirunilaganda Yal Panar. So he belonged to that disappearing tribe of Panars. He comes and meets Sambandhar once and narrates his misery. I have told that story in the paper. So he becomes an associate of Sambandhar. Okay? So he is from a very low caste. This caste didn't have rights to enter the temple, as per the narrative in Periya Puranam. But he becomes an associate of Sambandhar and goes around him. He gains not just entry into the temples, but respect in the temples. So there is an incident where Shiva orders the priests to put a golden seat for him, so that his Veena's strings will get cold if he sits on the floor. So what all this means is that there in another place, he stays in a Yajnashala of a great Vaidika Brahmin. So all these incidents, what do they narrate? That this Panar tribe and the music were gaining back that lost status. So it is narrated through these Puranic style things. So till today, there is this unbroken musical tradition in the Saiva temple through the community of Oduars. And when we come to language and literature, in one verse Sambandhar says, Ariyattudu Sendamil Payan Arigila Andhakar. So Jainas are blind men who don't know the divine nature of both Arya language, which is Samskrita, and the classical Tamil. He attacks them with many phrases. This is a historical fact. We know that the Prakrita and Jaina infused Tamil was promoted instead of the Samskrita, classical Tamil and Vedic studies during that period, during the Kalabra age. So it's a historical fact. But Sambandhar's reinvigorated Tamil poetic idiom, and to stress the importance of Vedas and Yajnas and Brahmanas, he makes reference to them repeatedly all through his verses. So he gives flamboyant epithets to himself, saying that Tamil Munivan means a Tamil sage, Tamil Viragan means Tamil wizard, Nanmarai Katravan, the one who knows all the four Vedas, Vedian. So these are some of the very colorful epithets that he gives to himself in his poems. So this means that, how they were the languages. Next slide. Status of women. This is a very important point. The Sangam literature has 30 plus women poets, like the Rishikas of Rigveda, including the great poet Avvayar. So, but the Kalabhra age had none, and the literary idioms on women were also changing. So the reason for this is that the Jaina theology states that women's birth is inferior and unfit for liberation. Again, there is no time here. I have given all the references in the paper as to where it is mentioned and all that. Okay? So they have to be reborn as men to become fit for liberation. Jaina theology says this. Of course, this would have directly led to a social condition where women didn't have learning and respect. But in Shaivism, Shakti, the divine feminine, is inseparable from Shiva, and this automatically led to social conditions favorable for women. And the Sambandhar's empathy and compassion for women is recorded through multiple incidents. Again, I have narrated them in some detail in the paper. So he cures the disease of one woman, epilepsy disease. In another case, he goes to a temple, a woman is crying. She is an independent woman who opposed her parents and walked away with her lover, whom she thought he was a dharmic person, and that guy is died to a snake bite. Sambandhar revives that lover. And in another episode, there is this girl called Poom Pavai, who is dead. And he brings her alive from the ash relics stored in a pot. So this is celebrated as a festival in Mylapore, Chennai, till today. And of all, the Pandya queen Mangair Karasi, right? So who comes and invites him to Madurai to counter the Jainas. So he bestows grace on him. In fact, he has sung one entire hymn about the glories of Mangair Karasi, where in the first 2 lines he praises Mangair Karasi, and the next 2 lines he praises Shiva. So all these point out, so these are all incidents in the Periya Purana, but there is a definitive historical narrative that the women were getting back their respect. And when you come to religion and society, there are multiple references to the Jaina persecution of the Shaivas in many stories of Periya Purana. So in case of Tirunavukarasar, so he was born in a Shaiva family, became a Jaina, and then got converted back to Shaivism. So the Jainas could not tolerate it. They complained to the kings, and all kind of tortures are described. Trampling by an elephant, put him in a lime kiln so that he gets burnt, right? And tie him in a rope and throw into the sea, all that. But he obviously escapes with the grace of Shiva from all this. It's debatable as to whether all this is historical or not, but this is mentioned in Periya Puranam. And in case of Dandi Nayanar, he wants to clean a pond. Jains object, saying that the insects will die. And then Naminandi Nayanar wants to light a lamp. Jains don't give him oil. All these kind of persecution stories are mentioned in Periya Puranam, but there is some historical core to it, because the Vedic Shaiva practices in the Pandya country especially were suppressed, because it was fully in the grip of Jainas. And what is the proof? We have no Nayanmar from that region, whereas the Nayanmars are distributed across all other geographic regions of Tamil Nadu, right? Like Chola and other regions. The only Nayanmars out of the 63 from Pandya are 3 people. You know what? The king, queen, and the minister, whom Sambandhar converted. Okay? So the Nayanmars in Pandya country come only after Sambandhar. So this itself is a kind of proof that about the Jaina influence. So Sambandhar has very harsh criticisms. So there are 384 Padigam or Dashakam in the Sambandhar corpus. Okay? Each has 10 verses. In each of these Dashakam, the 9th verse is always for Jainas and Bauddhas. Okay? So these verses are of course full of Shiva Bhakti and great literary merit. and he attacks Jainas and Thera Buddhas in the 10th verse. Even in his very first verse, which was sung when he was 3 years old, there is a condemnation of Jainas and Buddhas. Okay? So, see, if you are familiar with the Indian tradition, this is something very uncommon. Because you see such condemnation in the polemical texts. So, in the Khandana texts, you have these condemnations. So, one sect, even Jainas have attacked Vedic religionists. Vedic religionists have attacked Jainas. But as a part of a stotra, this won't be present typically. Because stotras are sung every day. But Sambandhar is a very big exception here. Every one of his stotra, there is one verse attacking Jainas and Buddhas. So he heaps scorn on them, that they oppose Vedas and Yajnas and Brahmanas. He attacks their beliefs. He attacks their religion itself as a false doctrine and their practices as filthy and vulgar. In fact, the word for Jainas in Tamil is Samanar. Samanar means naked. Okay? Digambara. So it has actually become a word of scorn in the language even today. But we should understand that he didn't have real malice towards Jains, because in one verse he says, it is Shiva who gave the Vedas. It is Shiva who, it is all his Leela, sport, that he created these false doctrines called Jaina and Bauddha, and I should go and counter them. You know. So since we are running out of time, I will just complete with this impalement story. So in the Madurai episode, which is described in a big detail in Periya Puranam, Sambandhar is invited to Madurai by the Pandya queen and minister. And it is said that in the whole kingdom, there are only 2 Shaivas. Okay? Queen and the minister. Everybody else has converted to Jainism, including the king. Okay? So it is said in Periya Puranam that Jainas make attempt on Sambandhar's life. So they set fire to the place where he is staying, etc. But he escapes. But the king gets a big disease because of this papa done to a Shiva devotee. So no Jain monk is able to cure the king. Sambandhar comes and cures the king by applying vibhuti. And after that, there is a big debate is mentioned between Sambandhar and Jainas. And we should note that this debate is nothing intellectual. It is like trial by fire, trial by water. So Sambandhar will write a verse and put in the fire. It will not burn. But the Jainas manuscript will burn. It will put in the water. The Jainas thing will, like this, it is some magical things are mentioned. No intellectual debate. At the end of it, Jainas lose, obviously. And it is said that by the king's order, Jainas are killed by that impalement method. And there is a repeated mention of this story in the Saiva literature. These pictures that I have shown, this is actually part of Saiva art. You see that there are some people with beard are put in that impalement machine, and we all know that the Jainas have shaven heads. Maybe the artist has made a mistake while depicting that episode. And in one version, Yenna Iravar, it is said, 8,000 Jain monks were killed this way. Okay? We must note that in Sambandhar's hymn, Tevaram hymn, there is mention of debate in Madurai. Okay? But there is no mention of this impalement. That's the contemporary account. He just prays to Shiva that I should win over Jains, and that's all is there. So now, let's see this story in the light of history. This is going to be my last slide. Okay? So this story is cited by everyone, including Romila Thapar, as an example of Hindu tolerance. But the only proof for this story is in Periya Puranam. So if we have to accept this as a history, we should also accept the Jaina persecution of Shaivas as history. But that they don't accept. Okay? They just give a one-sided narration. This has been pointed out by the likes of Sitaram Goel. But historians have always questioned this narrative. So there is a thorough research of this episode in this book called Samanar Kaluvetram. I have given the details. So the foremost evidence is that this first mention of impalement comes 500 years after Sambandhar's period. Okay? So it comes first in the verses of Nambiyandar Nambi, who is the compiler of the Shaiva canon. And then it becomes a very established Purana-like thing. But the first mention is after 500 years. And then there is no corroborative evidence in the Jain texts or records to this. So this book, which I show here, it has an interview with the Jain monk of a monastery in Tamil Nadu. And he flatly denies this episode. He says that we don't have any record. Shaivas have just created some, bravado story to boast. And the Jaina temples thrived in many parts of Tamil Nadu during 10th and 14th century, much after Sambandhar's time. And so all this means is that the popularity of this story in the tradition does not mean it is historical. So that's what I want to point out. And in conclusion, I want to say that no conflict with Jainas and Hindus, last slide, for many centuries, but much overlap in ahimsa, same deities, Lakshmi, Ganesha. We worship, Jains also worship, vegetarian food, many things. So the aim of this paper is not to open any historical wounds, but to set right the factual narrative, countering the negative and incorrect stereotyping of Hindu traditions and Hindu religious figures. And last bullet, there is scope for further research in this, that certain laboring classes like farmers, fisher folk, hunter tribes, and even the practice of untouchability, all this has much to do with the Jaina and Buddhist influences, because of this, their ahimsa doctrines, they kind of denigrated these laboring classes a lot. But if you see in the Saiva, we have hunter Nayanmars from the hunter community, fisherman community, and laboring classes. So this itself, I don't have a proper evidence, so I didn't put this in the paper. But there is scope for further research on this count. And with that, I end my talk.